Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to another Alternate History Hearts of Iron 4 video. As I'm sure many of you are already aware, the way that this thing works is that in my videos that we do on Alternate History, I take the top 5 most liked comments of that video, and I put that into a poll to determine what the next Alternate History video is going to be. In the case of this previous one, which was actually a combination between two different videos I did for the top contenders, by an overwhelming majority, a lot of you wanted to see what would have happened if Stalin lost the post-Lenin power struggle to Trotsky. Wow. Okay, this is going to cause me a major headache. My friends, I will be completely honest with you. I spent many hours combing through the varying different workshops, trying to find any mod that I could that took place during the interwar period that would actually allow this to happen. And unfortunately, none of them are actually good for the purposes that I need, or worse yet, they just straight up do not work. They're broken, they're old, they're out of date, and have not been updated for like 5 or 6 years, which I cannot then use. I thought that I was going to have some luck with the Great War mod, because that mod, which is not the Great War Redux, that actually has a start date that you can choose in 1919 at the very beginning of the interwar period, but the events that I need take place in like 1928, which is like way too far for any of this to actually work. So in the end, we're actually going to have to cheese things here, and we are going to need to use the base game in order to be able to create this. Start in 1936, but we're going to change how this starting scenario is going to work. In brief, for the history of the Soviet Union and what we're going to need to change, when the dust settled after the Russian Civil War, the USSR had emerged as the undisputed ruler over most of what constituted the Russian Empire. Rapid industrialization and collectivization followed, often at great cost in human lives. Yes, indeed, that happened, and it happened specifically under the directorship of... Yes, that happened, and it specifically happened under the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin. The thing that one has to understand about the Soviet Union and Soviet politics over the course of pretty much its entire history is that it is very contentious with a lot of backstabbing. Hence what we normally then see with the Soviet Union with how incredibly broken it can be, such as you see the thing in here with the Trotskyite plot. Paranoia and pathological distrust stemming from old power struggles impact the leadership of this nation. Yes, this is true. In order for us to be able to explain this scenario, I will have to go back a little bit into the history of the actual Soviet Union and what happened here when we talk about Trotsky. Because in the base game, you have 3 different alternate socialist paths that you can pursue. You have the historical one under Stalin, which is the center. You have the right opposition here under Bukharin. And then you have the left opposition under Trotsky. Historically, the left opposition is the thing that was the primary opposition of Stalin, and ultimately they would lose in the power struggle over the course of the late 1920s, which would result in Leon Trotsky first being exiled, and then later on in the game actually just getting straight up murdered in Mexico. With a pickaxe, mind you. But the proposal that we were given here in the very beginning was not, oh, what if Trotsky took power at the beginning of World War II or anything like that. No, it's what would have happened if he had actually won the power struggle? What would have happened if things ended with Trotsky in charge after Lenin's death? Well, I can't quite do it like that. And there's a very key reason why historically. So my friends, before it is that we then dive into the scenario, I'm going to have to provide a little bit of a history lesson. If you don't like it, deal with it. It's necessary. The likelihood of Trotsky taking power after the death of Lenin is pretty unlikely. Stalin was a master politician and an absolutely brutal and ruthless guy who would do anything possible in order to be able to take and maintain power. He was. Even though Trotsky had been with Lenin longer, he was simultaneously a guy who, in many of the years, had criticized Lenin and his ideas because he had his own ideas on how to run the world revolution, which is something that specifically he wanted. He wanted a global, worldwide, socialist workers' revolution. The thing was, that wasn't really possible for Trotsky in the Soviet Union, especially at the beginning. Under the new economic policy that had been set in motion by Lenin back in 1921, the Bolsheviks had to concentrate on economic recovery after all the years of war, both from World War I and then the Civil War that would subsequently follow, which would, tear the country apart. They couldn't finance a global revolution. That wasn't going to happen. Many workers who survived the conflict would just go into administrative roles within the Soviet Union itself, or relocate to the countryside and completely step away from things. Diplomatically, the USSR stood alone. There was no other communist states that came about afterwards, and even then, the ones that did, sort of, would very quickly crumble, such as the Soviet Republic that would occur in Hungary. You'd have the Red Scare in the United States that would completely crush any kind of communist power there. And then Italy in the early 20s, you would have the rise of Benito Mussolini, who himself was previously a socialist, but then became more hardline fascist. So political defeat after political defeat would follow in Germany, Estonia, Bulgaria, and more. It just, the revolution was not winning. It just wasn't. And so his ideas were not nearly as popular. After Lenin died in January of 1924, the question would then arise immediately about who was going to be the next leader of the Soviet Socialist Republics. Trotsky was one of the most recognizable figures, and he could have been the person who did take charge, but politically, his ideas had not gone over as well, and simultaneously, Stalin, who was actually more of a political outlier for years, had been steadily accumulating power in the background. And he was going to use that. The way that he was able to accumulate all this power was that in 1922, Lenin, who appreciated Stalin's organizational capabilities, went and appointed him as the general secretary of the Communist Party. You need to understand how powerful a position this was. It meant that he had the authority to be able to choose who could and could not be a member of the Communist Party. He was able to appoint people into positions of power, meaning that he was able to accumulate his own power base and from that get a lot of loyalty. This was going to build quite heavily over the next couple of years, and so when Lenin died in 1924, it was Stalin who had actually accumulated a lot of authority behind him, instead of Trotsky, who was currently in dispute with other leaders of the Soviets. Because of how that all went down, and because of the time period that this is taking place in, I'm not going to be able to change literally any of that. That's not going to work out for me. But it's okay, because there were other opportunities, and this is a key part of the history that we have to explain. Because these guys had completely different ideas on how communism and the revolution was supposed to operate. In 1924, Stalin would introduce the notion of socialism in one country. A socialist society could be built, as Stalin would say, in the Soviet Union alone, regardless of what was going on in the international scene. This concept did appeal to many Bolsheviks that had to deal with the isolation of the Soviet state, as really everything else in the world had failed by that point. Stalin went on to directly counter the idea of Trotsky's emphasis on permanent world revolution. And so thanks to Stalin, Trotskyism soon became a term of globalist elite ideology that lacked a connectedness to the base masses and workers and peasants of the Soviet Union. During the mid-1920s, Trotsky would respond to these developments by calling for a restoration of workers' democracy within the Communist Party, and while he had advocated centralization during the Civil War, this was only out of necessity. He specifically was a person who wanted to decentralize power in comparison to Stalin, who rapidly wanted to centralize it. Over the course of the 1920s, then, he would build up a coalition of different leaders and military people and other advisors within the Soviet Union in order to be able to stand against Stalin as the left opposition, as it says here. But due to infighting, this would ultimately end up collapsing, and eventually, by the late 1920s, Trotsky would be exiled from the Soviet Union. Not just once, but multiple times. First out of the Soviet Union, then out of Turkey, out of Norway, and then finally he would end up in Mexico, where eventually he ends up getting assassinated. At the time that this game takes place in 1936, Trotsky has already been exiled, but he still has technically a power base inside the Soviet Union. And Stalin, for the previous 2 years, has been in the process of purging things within the Soviet Union. In 1936 to 1937 and 1938, as all these varying different show trials were taking place within the Soviet Union, which, you know, you get to see over here on this site with like the anti-Soviet Trotsky Center and then the military conspiracy and whatnot. Trotsky was off in foreign countries writing about all of this and showing to the world what was happening in the Soviet Union and just how horribly politically corrupt it was. It would be exceptionally difficult for us to argue that Trotsky was able to take power after the death of Lenin. Is it possible? Yes, but I can't really recreate it right now with this thing that I'm trying to do here. Instead, at the beginning of 1936, there was a growing movement specifically within the Soviet Union against Stalin. Except this would never actually manifest because through a combination of bribery and terror, Stalin was able to control the varying different elements within the Soviet Union, taking their families hostage, assassinating people, appointing them to lucrative positions, pretty much anything and everything in order to be able to maintain power, and he did it, even if it absolutely crippled the Soviet Union. That's one of the things that made it so incredibly easy for Germany to be able to invade, at least initially with the start of Operation Barbarossa. There was a chance, though, that at the start of all these purges, when this period was happening in between 1934 and 1936, that potentially the Trotskyites could have united. They could have taken back power. They could have gathered all those varying different opponents of Stalin that were being used and abused and strung them together at least long enough in order to be able to overthrow him. Potentially. Maybe. And so that's what we were going to do here now. First off, there's nothing that we're really going to be able to change about our industry. We can't really change anything when it comes to our civilian factories, our military factories, anything like that, because we are going to assume in this time period that things follow the same thing that they did in our own historical timeline, where the Soviet Union has this large industrial base that could appear, but right now it is still very quite backwards and has been in the process of trying to modernize. We can say that many of these industrial efforts were even harsher than they were in our own timeline, which in turn anger many of the common people of the Soviet Union, as well as turn more political leaders against Stalin. Still though, he has power. Go ahead and get our basic research out of the way to get that done, and on this for civilian factories. During this time, the Soviet Union, rather than focusing on just heavy industry, was specifically trying to build as many tractors, among other things, as they could. Stalin, being in power, specifically wanted to focus on development of the Soviet Union, not outside forces. So less attention arguably would be given to military matters, and more focus would be given on specifically trying to strengthen things internally, rather than trying to export weapons externally. Though, obviously, he would still end up doing similar things. Go ahead and get our very large industrial base here set up, make sure that all that is done, and then take our massive army, slap that into just one big whole thing. We don't really need to worry about that, and we are then going to need to go ahead and check out our focuses. Now, the Soviet Union has a fairly big and significant tree, but what we're going to need to do is rapidly accelerate down one side, and from that, we're actually going to have to cheat here in the beginning in order to say that things are going to take place rapidly in 1936 versus taking place in, say, 1937 or 1938. The purges are already underway, and a movement is growing against Stalin. To that end, focused on autocomplete, and after that, we are going to need the path of Marxism-Leninism, the left opposition, and then normally what you do in a proper playthrough is that you would spend time doing all these varying different focuses, which would strengthen your position during the course of the Civil War, so that way things are easier for you. What we will say from this time is that Trotsky actually had more supporters, or that less of his supporters had been successfully purged, that more people turned against Stalin, and so it is easier for them to go and gather allies. So the old Trotskyites are brought back, the workers are organized, the NKVD is infiltrated, support from other party members is gained, and more of the military members would end up siding with, specifically, Trotsky. Now, there's two possible options that we really have here. Eliminate the right, or to say cooperation against Stalin. The thing about this is that, as I already explained, there was a lot of historical infighting within the Soviet Union, a lot of backstabbing, a lot of pretty much everything. There are factions inside of the party that are utterly incompatible with each other. If we are to take over the government and steer the revolution back on track, we cannot afford to be distracted by their meddling. But if Comrade Stalin is looking for internal enemies to fight, we could implicate some people for him to take a look at. Yes, the elimination of the right is something that theoretically could have been done, but since we are saying that the left was able to gain more allies in the beginning in order to be able to oppose Stalin, we are instead going to go down the path of cooperation against Stalin. Whatever our difference is, at this stage in the struggle, we must be unified in our opposition against Stalin. Yes, this is more likely going to break down rapidly just as it did in our own timeline back in the 1920s, but hey, you know what? It is what it is. Along with that, that means that the Zinovyites are going to join us, and also Rutin. The varying different entities that had been arrested, thrown away, sidelined by Stalin are going to be united against him. And with that, I have to then go ahead and turn this off because we actually need time to pass in order for anything to literally happen. Yeah. Stalin, in the meanwhile, would have been focused more on developing heavy industry within the country and simultaneously purging all opposition, which is the very thing that unites people against him. Joseph Stalin concerned about factionalism. In a recent session of the Central Committee, Comrade Joseph Stalin noted the growing factionalism inside the party. While all members of the committee were quick to assure him of their full and unconditional support, this has apparently done very little to ease his concerns. According to Comrade Joseph Stalin, we must always be vigilant for saboteurs and wreckers who plot against the state in whatever position they may be. This news comes as a bit of a surprise to many in the party who believe that the threat of the party split with Trotsky's exile, but no. Since 1934, there would be many people who'd be arrested, executed, and, well, worse. With that, we will say that by February of 1936, the flames of war are ignited, or at least the hostile takeover will take place. The time has come, let us raise the banners against the tyrant, the revolution will begin anew. Of course, as this happens, naturally it's going to be Trotsky, who we're going to say is the one who corrals everyone together and leads the charge. The chances of such an event like this breaking out into outright civil war are pretty high, but for the purpose of this argument, considering that we are trying to say that he actually won the power struggle, we will say that conflict was far more limited than it would be in the state of an actual civil war if that had taken place in 1936. So how do we fix this issue where we only own a tiny portion of the country, yet still the overwhelming majority of the military? Well, rather simple. We cheat. Yeah, really in this situation, considering what it is that I have to work with, there's not much else that I can really do. So we're just going to go ahead and speed through this, in which we take over the entire country in rapid order. Partisans rise up all across that have been organized by the left opposition, and with that, we will say that the Soviet military, entities within which had been made largely ineffective by Stalin's purges and simultaneously alienated many of the elite officers, that the people within it, that those of actual power and authority, stand against Stalin and side with Trotsky this time. Is a lot of what I'm saying here wishful thinking? Yes. Theoretically, it is possible. It could have happened, but chances are it would result in a horribly bloody civil war. It's just what we have to kind of work with here. In rapid order, we will say that Stalin is captured, he is more than likely executed afterwards, and the Union of Soviet Republics is saved. Yay. It is, of course, immediate capitulation. Everything falls apart for them. And we actually keep the majority of the military. We actually say from this, because the majority of the military leaders that would have been purged ended up siding with Trotsky, that this means that actually about 75-80% of the military ends up siding with Trotsky and thus is spared. With that, my friends, the uprising is over. Leon Trotsky, the permanent revolutionary, is in charge in 1936. The question is, what happens next? Well, the thing is, although Trotsky and Stalin differed on how it is that they wanted to manage collectivization, management, and everything else, by the year 1936, there really isn't anything that could be done regarding what had already happened within Ukraine and other things, like the Holodomor. This was something that Trotsky had strongly opposed and Stalin had pushed through in an effort to centralize his power and control, and Trotsky would be forced to accept that. The damage had already been done. The best he could do at this point is try to salvage things. In our own timeline, the difference between Stalin and Trotsky is that Stalin would largely focus primarily internally. The purges, everything that had happened with the military, everything that had happened with the industry, this would both strengthen and simultaneously weaken the Soviet Union. It would damage its military base, it would damage its leadership, it would damage just about everything about it, but simultaneously it would rapidly industrialize during this time period, which would overall strengthen it after, well, a few years into the invasion by the Germans. One could make an argument that under Trotsky, with less insane goals and less insane control over everything as Stalin had, that the people, the businesses, I say businesses, the industry actually performed better than it did in our own timeline, that there was less disruption and maybe a little bit less corruption, among other things. So to get people back to work, a massive infrastructure effort would be launched. The Union of Soviet Republics of Europe and Asia is vast, but mostly empty. We must secure the ability to transport goods and equipment across the width of the country quickly. As for where the capital of the Union of the Soviet Republics of Europe and Asia is going to be after the war, it brings up an interesting question. Would this actually be something that Trotsky would want to change? Maybe he would keep everything in Moscow, but more than likely, in order to align himself with things of the past and associate him more closely with Lenin, he would move things to Leningrad, where the revolution started. Of course, while this internal chaos is happening, things are still going to proceed just as they kind of did in our own timeline. Turkey would go and seize control over the Bosporus. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk has declared that the Turkish Straits will now fall under the complete control of Turkey, thus giving the Turkish government the ability to close the straits to us at their own discretion. This is absolutely unacceptable. It means that the Turkish government has decided that they have the right to trap our own fleets in the Black Sea whenever they feel politically expedient to do so. Mobilize the armed forces immediately. With Trotsky in charge, an individual who is more inclined to the worldwide revolution and arguably from that more volatile towards outside sources, there's a chance that he would escalate this into a conflict much more readily than Stalin would. But through compromise and negotiation, access would still be granted. At the same time though, on top of industry, on top of everything that is happening, this is where Trotsky would try to begin to spread the seeds of revolution. It is the mid-1930s at this point. It means that the world is still very unstable. It is still something that is suffering from the Great Depression. As much as Trotsky would love to jump into the permanent revolution immediately, there are still things internally that need to be fixed and taken care of. First off, instead of centralizing things entirely under his authority, one of the things that Trotsky long time advocated for was a more decentralized model. Yes, he centralized things out of necessity back during the Russian Civil War, but specifically, he wanted to return more power to the workers, not to the oligarchs who would end up controlling things under Stalin. Now that we've started the long road towards the true liberation of the working class, we must not fall to the temptation of replacing one government of the elite with another. The government of our union must always be a true government of the workers, by the workers, and for the workers. De-Stalinization. The revolution is triumphant, the dictator has fallen, and once again, the proletariat rule the country. The cultish behavior of Stalin must be stopped, and all of its symbols must be removed. The cities named after Stalin and his followers need to be renamed to something more fitting. This is especially true for the city of Stalingrad. Yeah, you get Volograd or Trotskygrad as a name. Here's the thing. The idea of Trotsky then going in and trying to rename all this other stuff after himself is less likely. He was more, we could say, ideologically aligned with communism and the ideals of Lenin than Stalin ultimately would end up being. So the idea of taking that upon himself, even though he was his own kind of mad genocidal dictator as well, or had the chance to be, he's probably a little bit less full of himself than Stalin, so Volgograd would definitely be a more fitting name. We're going to return all these to their more original names. To the end of trying to improve the country, instead of relying on a horrible quota system and the way that everything was managed under Stalin, we will say that worker conditions were improved during this time. Yes, it is still going to be the command-style economy, but it is going to be a more decentralized model, and people on the ground are going to have more authority over their own actions than it is that they did in our own time. Thus, morale would probably be higher at this point. With the establishment of a more worker-oriented government, it brings up an interesting question, though. Removing the counter-revolutionaries or returning the party to democracy. Specifically, what Trotsky wanted to do is that he wanted to return things to a more democratic ideal. Not in the sense of like the capitalist West, but specifically giving power back to the workers, and from that, hopefully having a bit of a less cliquey arrangement in the government. Now, truthfully, realistically, the thing that is likely to happen is that forces are going to end up being purged, that the right wing, that the right opposition that had joined with them would also end up being purged just as they were in our own timeline. This is arguably the most realistic thing, but theoretically, we will say here is that if they had sided early enough, that many of these were able to be saved and that a return to democracy for the party would occur. This is something that Trotsky really wanted to push for. There was a point during the revolution where we could not afford to get bogged down in endless discussions about the very best way forward, but the times have changed and the time has come to fulfill the promise of democracy in all aspects of life made to the workers. These also means that we can now allow people back into the party whose well-intentioned criticism was once seen as sabotage. The purges were to never happen again, at least not while Trotsky was in charge. As all this is happening, civil war would break out in Spain, and naturally, just as in our own time under Stalin, Trotsky would end up throwing his full weight behind the support of the Spanish Republicans. From that, trying to support as many communist elements within it as possible. In our own timeline, what ended up happening is that the Soviet Union not only used and abused things with the Republican Spain, but also, thanks to much of their meddling and Spain's own internal problems, the Republicans were soundly defeated after years of brutal conflict. They were way more divided than the nationalists ever were, and Stalin's efforts to assassinate and intimidate many elements within the side that were not Stalinist were seen as, well, counterproductive, we should say. Trotsky, though, on the other hand, even though he would want to support communism naturally within Spain, simultaneously he would see the nationalists as being a bigger threat and wishing to oppose them, and would thus send over even more efforts to try and counter the fascists of the Italians and the Germans. The rise of Mustache Man into power back in 1933 was seen as a great insult and horrible failure by Trotsky. Well, failure by Stalin, but Trotsky saw this as that. He was not going to let them have their way this time. The question is then, what next? Considering how attention would be divided here against Spain, that simultaneously means that less attention would be able to be dedicated to the Baltics and other territory. Instead, internal developments would have to be stabilized within the Soviet Union, and from that, the military industry strengthened in order to be able to prepare for the worldwide revolution. At the same time, the intelligence agency of the Soviet Union would be prepared in order to be able to spread the revolutionary fervor and weaken opposing countries in preparation. So, to that end, the Red Army would be rebuilt. Whatever it may have become in the meantime, the Red Army will always be the brainchild of Lev Trotsky. It is time for him to return to his former position and lead a new and invigorated Red Army into battle, with Trotsky become a field marshal to be able to lead the men to glory. Yes, my friends, the argument that we are going to make in this time period is that more aid is sent by the Soviets in order to be able to prop up the Spanish Republicans. Perhaps this is something that causes Germany and Italy to send even more aid over to the nationalists, and by chance this could do multiple things. We could say that it prolongs the war even longer so that it doesn't end in 1939, it goes all the way into the 1940s, maybe. Or through grand efforts and leadership, perhaps, maybe, perhaps, the Spanish Republicans with more Soviet aid and less interference actually end up doing better and even winning. Along with the efforts of trying to rebuild the military, it would simultaneously be depoliticized. This is something where, yes, political officers are still going to be a feature, of course, but less so under Trotsky than they were under Stalin. The primary purpose of the military is to protect the working class. Our soldiers are, to a large extent, already members of the working class, and therefore don't need someone to watch over them. Even more important is that the Red Army focuses on its primary mission and is not allowed to play at politics. Instead, its goal is to help to spread the revolution, not just contain things internally. Through these greater actions of support, perhaps less interference, a greater supply of guns, it means that the Spanish are able to hold off the nationalists at a much greater degree. Now, instead of Madrid being forced into a siege that would pretty much last the entirety of the war, mass volunteers of communist revolutionaries from around the world, under the leadership of Lev Trotsky, would arrive in Spain and be able to start pushing and turning the tide. It is thus by the beginning of 1937 that the 5-year plan would effectively be finished. The second 5-year plan prioritized the development of heavy industry, and the Soviet Union must develop quickly in order to match the capitalist and fascist powers of the West. This would be done, and then from here, a third 5-year plan would potentially be able to be launched, but development must take place. Spain relocates gold reserves. Shipments from Spain have begun to arrive at our country as the Spanish government is moving their gold reserves abroad for safekeeping for the duration of the war. Yeah. Safekeeping, we'll say. As all this is happening, though, Trotsky would be in the process of trying to decentralize the system, to be able to strengthen things within the Soviet Union as he saw it. Stalin centralized not just the party, but the entire country on himself. This is clearly a counter-revolutionary approach, taking power away from the workers and putting it into the hands of corrupt elite. We need to reverse this direction and allow the workers to decide their own fate again. Spanish gold reserves. It's been some time since the Spanish gold reserves arrived in our country, and we've continued to send ample aid to the nationalist Spain, to Republican Spain without payment. Members of the government are beginning to comment on the farcical state of these affairs. You will seize the gold reserves as payment. A Spanish victory would be payment enough. Yeah, what is going to likely end up happening is that in the name of the worldwide revolution, this gold would end up being seized, specifically in order to be able to fund revolutionary efforts. And though this may anger the Spanish, simultaneously with the amount of aid that they are receiving, we're going to utilize it. That's going to happen. German-Soviet treaty. Despite harsh previous rhetoric against both the people and the ideological leadership of the Union of Soviet Republics, Adolf Hitler and Germany have now reached out to us requesting our mutually beneficial research treaty. While exchanging knowledge would help our efforts to develop new tank designs along with promises of other research benefits in the future, there is little doubt, considering previous statements, that the Germans are doing this for their own sake. Should we go forward with the agreement despite the risk of aiding Adolf's ambitions? The answer that we are going to say here is no. No, we are not. Trotsky was far less trusting of the mustache man than Stalin was, and so the chances of the Soviets making any kind of deal with the Germans is exceptionally low. Instead, the Soviet Union will develop itself, and it will actually still have quite a number of innovations that it will make, but also keep for itself, which is the key and important thing. As volunteers from, at this point, probably across the globe, in the global call for revolution arrive in Spain, it means that gradually the numbers will be able to turn against the nationalists. With the gaining of ground by the Republicans, which over time would see more and more communist-leaning, this would spell a lot of trouble for the Germans and the Italians, which over the course of the conflict in our own timeline had sent over thousands of men, many millions of cartridges, tank, planes, guns, pretty much anything that you can think of. And while this was a valuable learning experience for both the Italians and the Germans, losses in here would be both a national embarrassment and simultaneously a drain on resources for both. These would be veterans that neither the Italians or the Germans would ever get back. Still, at the beginning of 1938, the Anschluss of Austria would still happen, and this is something that would send shockwaves across Europe. The Soviets would of course be watching this with apprehension, and would likely, under Trotsky, then declare that the Soviets would not gain an inch more ground. No, my friends, after the Anschluss, it would be time for a permanent revolution. The Soviets would not be able to let the Germans take one step further. Marxist theory teaches that the revolution is inevitable if the circumstances are right. However, the circumstances are clearly not right, or not right everywhere. We must not grow complacent and wait for a world revolution that may be centuries away. Workers and peasants from around the world are suffering right now, today, and their liberation cannot wait. With the creation of the idea of a permanent revolution, this means that a global class struggle will be able to take place. Any kind of entity that borders the Germans, anything that borders the Italians, well, really anything at all for that matter, is going to have spies, entities of the Soviets sent in order to be able to stir things up on the ground. A fight to liberate the working class must be the definition of a global struggle. As long as there is even one country supporting the capitalist system, the revolution isn't safe. Once the workers around the world realize that the revolution is once again on the march, they will flock to our banner and support us in our endeavors. Perhaps then it is, by mid-1938, if enough support had been gained from international communist efforts, that the Republicans maybe in this timeline, would be victorious. Naturally, in order to be able to protect the revolution, claims would be made in the Baltic, and specifically these states that exist within it would need to be brought back into the fold, as they have left Mother Russia. The revolution, of course, is not going to stop there. Additional claims will be made specifically upon Poland. Poland holds territories that have been Russian for centuries, splitting Ukraine and Belarus between our nations. This is an unacceptable state of affairs. They may have bested us in 1921, but we should remind them that times have changed. Still, the Germans do not stop. The Munich Agreement takes place, the Sudetenland is annexed by the Germans, and from that, the Soviets grow even more alarmed. Efforts would need to be made in order to speed things up. Just as in our own timeline, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all would submit to the Soviet Union. With claims being made upon Poland, there are a couple options that we have. Either Eastern Poland could be demanded, just as what would happen in our own timeline under Stalin, or Poland could be offered protection. Poland and the Polish people have suffered many deprivations and humiliations of the century. It's an open secret that the Germans want the territories given to Poland after the Great War back, and are willing to use violence to get them. We should offer Polish governmental protection so long as they're willing to discuss the issue of our shared border. Now, Poland was actually decently friendly with Germany at this time, at least at the time we're talking about here in 1938. Pretty much right up until the point of invasion, the Polish did not want to fight the Germans. They did not think necessarily that they would have to fight the Germans. But theoretically, if Trotsky has been in power, then elements of the Communist Party within Poland have likely been working overtime in order to be able to weaken things from the inside out. As such, there is a chance that maybe they accept our offer of protection. Offering to take Poland under our wing and guide them for future conquest in the West in exchange for territory in the East turned out to be a successful approach. Being promised a share of Germany in case of a successful war and our protection, they agreed to cede their eastern territories peacefully. An ally against Germany is much preferable to another partition. Absolutely wonderful. As 1938 prepares to head into 1939, this is where things become exceptionally questionable. There is the idea of carrying the revolution east, or the onslaught of colonialism, which is going to take us further against the West. But specifically, all efforts would have to be made to try and rehabilitate the military in the first place. You cannot have a global revolution without a military to be able to back things. Ironically, because of our initial seizure of the Baltic, this means that Germany is now actually demanding Memel from us. Perhaps anticipating a quick strike and a show of force, the Germans have gone and actually declared war upon us. Something that, well, they should not have done. Germany at the beginning of 1939 was most certainly not prepared for war. Even at the time that they were demanding land from Czechoslovakia, among others, they were in a very fragile state. The chances of this working for them are exceptionally low. The thing is, because the purges never really took place, or took place to a limited degree, this means that the Soviet military would be significantly less effective than it was in our own timeline. Yes, some things still would have happened, but overall, there would be significantly more competent leaders, industry would have been less disrupted, the Soviets would have actually been in a stronger position had Trotsky, well, actually been able to take power earlier, instead of going through the harsh reality under Stalin first. From this, German forces that most certainly were not prepared would likely very quickly be run out of Prussia. Of course, with a still severely out-of-date air force, among other things, it means that that is likely to be eviscerated by Luftwaffe, at least in the beginning. But with time, this can be dealt with and losses can be replaced. Of course, as German reinforcements flood into Prussia, this in and of itself would create a very dangerous thing. Soviet forces would still this time technically be kind of outclassed, but their numbers would simultaneously be much greater and the Germans would not have much ammunition or fuel or anything to speak of in this time. Eventually, perhaps in order to be able to get additional strike upon the Soviet Union, the Germans would declare war upon Poland, which in turn would draw them into a greater conflict with the West. The Germans would now be at war on all sides. Quickly, a request would be made to allow Soviet forces through the border, which in turn would be accepted by Poland. As German forces flood through the line in order to be able to try and get an additional attack, Soviet forces desperately tried to move forward to hold the charge. With the German war machines surrounded on all sides, quickly the attacking forces in Prussia would be surrounded and killed, even as inroads were made into Prussia. Not Prussia, Poland. Why I say, you know what it is that I mean. Because of these actions, because Germany would not have been prepared by early 1939 and was now at war on all sides, this means that German industry would not be able to keep up. With no allies to speak of, Italy, in this case, though they are allied with Germany, would not actually end up joining in on the conflict in our own timeline until after Germany had already successfully invaded France. With this invasion going, well, horribly by this sense, and with the French now greatly outnumbering the Germans, it means that even with all their issues, they are able to push slightly into the Rhine, while the Soviets continuously grind their way west. Even suffering horrendous casualties, the march of the Soviets will still push deep into Germany itself. At this point, we've lost what? Okay, 300,000. Yeah, that is quite a bit. The Yalta Conference. With the war against the German Reich marching towards this inevitable conclusion, the United Kingdom has approached us about a conference on the future of Europe. They're suggesting a division of the German Reich between East and West, which would allow our sphere of influence to extend deep into Europe and would make up for some of the losses we've suffered in the gruesome struggle. The question is, at this point, whether or not the Soviets would accept. that. A war at this point, by 1940, is perhaps not something that the Soviets would be prepared with for the Allies, but at the same time, because of their great strides and bonuses they have made, theoretically, this means that they would refuse. They would not wish to work with any of the democratic capitalist powers, as that would weaken the position of Trotsky, who would advocate against such a thing. No, we will dictate our own peace. With that, my friends, by perhaps the beginning of 1940, only a year into the conflict, Germany would collapse. Though theoretically, I explained this, I can't actually accurately create what would happen in this time, perhaps not until the next DLC comes out. In the event that the Germans are not able to take any land whatsoever, this means that Adolf's position would have become untenable. His generals were already planning to betray him multiple times and take over the state, as they did not believe that Germany was ready, and it is only pretty much through sheer dumb luck that Germany was able to take as much land as it did in our own timeline. In the event that Germany is at war on all sides with all powers, there is no hope for them. Oh dear God, what have I done? Yes, my friends, in the aftermath of such a conflict, things become rather interesting. Poland, Germany, Czechoslovakia, all are puppets of the Soviet Union. A Soviet Union which gradually, with time, will begin to decentralize itself and create its own Eastern Bloc. However, unlike what happened in our own timeline, though damaged, the Soviet Union would not be nearly in as bad of a position as it was in our own. It would suffer millions of less casualties, significantly less damage to its industry, and yet from this, would now own Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. From that, the industrial base of these combined countries would be able to theoretically supercharge the Soviet Union, allowing it to be able to funnel funds into a worldwide global revolution. Italy would have never had the opportunity to be able to join in on the conflict, as, well, Germany never successfully invaded France. The Allies, which had began to rearm themselves in preparation for an attack by Germany, would actually manage to survive, with significantly less damage being done to them. Of course, the great threat at this point would be seen to be the Soviet Union, and efforts would likely be made by these varying different powers to undermine the Soviets, just as efforts by the Soviets would be made to undermine the Allies. The biggest problem, arguably, that we have to face at this point is how powerful is the Soviet Union really in this time? Thanks to the Soviet tree that you can see here, we would gain the ability to effectively wage war upon the entire world, but quite frankly, considering how long I've been recording this already, I do not have the time to do all of that. In Hearts of Iron, these decisions would allow me to go and be able to stir up communist sympathy in other countries and then wage war against them, causing uprisings within them. This is something that Trotsky would more than likely try to do, something that would be seen as a great threat by the UK and France, which would likely end up teaming up with the United States in order to be able to fight the Soviet Union if that should happen. But that seems significantly too aggressive. Even though that is the mechanic of the game, what more than likely would end up happening is that past this, it would devolve into a state of Cold War, in which the Soviet Union, through any number of propaganda, espionage, or other efforts, would try to undermine things in the West in order to be able to supplant them with communist forces. The most likely to fall among all these is France, which had to deal with its own communist problem in our own timeline, and after the fall of France, this means revolutions would likely also be seen in Spain, and then maybe afterwards in Italy. The only ones that would truly remain in that circumstance would be the United Kingdom and the United States, which would likely pour and funnel all efforts into counter-espionage efforts, and specifically fight in the potential civil wars that would break out here. I know at this point, at the time I'm talking about this, I'm spinning hypotheticals off of hypotheticals, but really, there's simply way too much to actually manage and do at this time to continue. The fascinating thing is that if Trotsky had been in charge, then the Soviet Union would have moved to stop Germany earlier, which in turn would have helped to, well, not result in millions of more people dying. I think by virtue of what I've had to do here, I'm going to end today's video, but it's still a fascinating scenario to consider. Because of how we had to cheese things here, I didn't get to do nearly as much gameplay, so I'm hoping that we can address that in another video here, but that will depend upon what choices you all make down in the comment section below. Thank you, my friends, for watching, and I think I'll see you all here next time. Goodbye, my friends.